The morning sun painted the Nebraska grassland golden as Maggie Sullivan adjusted the worn leather strap of her father's old satchel. Her boots, cracked from months of walking, pressed into the soft earth as she looked back one last time at the small town of Cedar Falls. The people there had been kind enough, offering her work washing clothes and mending tears in their Sunday best. But kindness wasn't enough to keep her there. 3 days ago, Mrs. Henderson from the general store had pulled her aside with concern written all over her weathered face. "Child, this wandering life ain't natural for a young woman. You should find yourself a husband, settle down proper like." The older woman meant well, but her words felt like chains to Maggie. She'd spent 23 years watching other women disappear into marriages that swallowed their dreams whole. The prairies stretched endlessly before her, waves of grass rolling toward the horizon like a green ocean. Most folks called this land empty, but Maggie saw something different. She saw freedom. Every step took her further from the expectations that had followed her since childhood, further from the well-meaning advice of people who couldn't understand why a woman would choose. Uncertainty over security. Her father had understood, though. Patrick Sullivan had been different from other men of his time. When Maggie was 12 and begged to help with the heavy farm work, he didn't send her back to the kitchen. Instead, he taught her to read the weather in the clouds, to feel the health of soil between her fingers, and to fix whatever broke with nothing but determination and spare parts. "Strength isn't about your muscles, Maggie girl," he used to say while they worked side by side under the scorching sun. "It's about knowing you can handle whatever comes your way." Those lessons had carried her through the worst year of her life. The drought came first, turning their green fields brown and brittle. Then the bank notices arrived, each one more threatening than the last. Her father fought until the very end, working himself sick trying to save their land. When the fever took him that winter, Maggie found herself alone with nothing but debt and the clothes on her back. Her uncle, Timothy, had arrived for the funeral with an offer that sounded generous on the surface. "Come back to Philadelphia with me," he'd said, straightening his city coat against the prairie wind. "My wife needs help with the children, and you'll have a roof over your head." But Maggie knew what that really meant. She'd become an unpaid servant, grateful for scraps and expected to smile about it. The thought made her stomach turn. So she'd packed what little she owned and started walking. The first weeks had been the hardest. Her hands, soft from the brief respite after her father's death, quickly developed new calluses from whatever work she could find. In the small town of Miller's Creek, she'd spent 5 days helping the local doctor's wife tend to a family struck down by influenza. The work was hard and the pay small, but she'd learned valuable skills about healing herbs and tending the sick. From there, she'd moved on to Riverside, where a farmer's wife needed extra hands during wheat harvest. Maggie worked alongside the other women, but she noticed things they didn't. She saw how the farmer's eldest son looked at his wife with growing resentment as their third baby grew heavy in her belly. She watched the way the farmer himself seemed to shrink a little more, each day under the weight of providing for so many mouths. "You're different from most girls," old Clara Peterson had told her one evening as they sat shelling peas on the farmhouse porch. Clara was the closest thing to a grandmother the scattered community had, and folks respected her opinion. "Got fire in you that won't be put out easy. Some men will try to snuff that flame, but the right one will help it burn brighter." The words stuck with Maggie as she continued her journey. In each town she encountered the same curious stares and whispered conversations. Women her age were supposed to be married by now, raising children and keeping house. The fact that she traveled alone, worked for her own keep, and showed no interest in settling down made her something of a curiosity. Some folks treated her with suspicion, wondering what kind of woman would choose such an unconventional life. Others showed her kindness tinged with pity, certain that she must be running from some terrible tragedy or scandal. A few even tried to play matchmaker, introducing her to local bachelors who might tame her wild ways. But Maggie had no interest in being tamed. Every morning when she woke up in whatever barn or boarding house had given her shelter, she felt a fierce joy at the freedom to choose her own direction. Would she head north toward the newer settlements or west toward the open range? The choice was entirely hers. Her reputation began to spread along the scattered network of frontier communities. The Walking Woman, they called her, and the name carried different meanings depending on who spoke it. To some, it was said with disapproval, as if her very existence challenged the natural order of things. To others, particularly women trapped in unhappy situations, it was spoken with a kind of wistful admiration. She learned to read people quickly, knowing within minutes of arriving in a new place whether she'd find friendly work or suspicious hostility. The skills her father had taught her about reading the land served her well in reading people too. She could spot a genuine offer of help from a mile away, just as easily as she could identify the men who saw her independence as a challenge to be conquered. Winter tested her resolve like nothing else had. When the first snow fell, many people expected her to give up her wandering ways and accept someone's offer of permanent shelter. But Maggie had learned to plan ahead during her months on the trail. She'd saved every penny she could, and when the cold weather hit, she found work in the larger town of Hastings, helping at the boarding house where travelers waited out the worst storms. The work was steady but not easy. She washed sheets, cleaned rooms, and helped in the kitchen from dawn to dusk. The other women who worked there were mostly wives supplementing their husbands' income, and they looked at Maggie with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What will you do when you get too old for this wandering life?" they'd ask during their brief breaks. A woman needs security, needs family. Maggie understood their concerns, but she also saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the way they counted every penny and worried constantly about their children's futures. Their security came at a price that felt too high to her. She'd rather face an uncertain future as herself than a certain future as someone else's burden or possession. When spring arrived and the roads became passable again, Maggie felt the familiar stirring in her chest that meant it was time to move on. She'd saved enough money to buy better boots and a warmer coat, practical investments in her chosen lifestyle. The boarding house owner, a kind woman named Mrs. Kowalski, had grown fond of Maggie over the winter months. "You know you're welcome to stay," she said as Maggie packed her few belongings. "I could use someone reliable year-round, and you've proven yourself capable." It was a generous offer, the kind of steady work most women in her position would accept gratefully, but Maggie felt that familiar pull toward the horizon, toward possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. "Thank you kindly," she replied, meaning every word, "but I've got more road ahead of me yet." As she walked away from Hastings that bright spring morning, her steps felt lighter than they had in months. The prairie was coming alive again after the long winter, and she was part of that awakening. Somewhere out there was the life she was meant to live, and she intended to keep walking until she found it. The sky had been promising trouble all morning. Dark clouds rolled across the prairie like smoke from a distant fire, and the air felt heavy with the kind of electricity that made horses nervous and smart folk seek shelter. Maggie had learned to read weather signs during her months on the trail, but this storm was moving faster than she'd expected. She'd been walking since dawn, following a barely visible path that wound along the Platte River. Her plan was to reach the settlement of Grand Valley before nightfall, but the approaching storm had other ideas. The first fat raindrops started falling just as she spotted a dark shape in the distance that looked like it might offer shelter. As she got closer, she could see it was an old soddy, one of those prairie homes built from blocks of earth and grass that homesteaders used when timber was scarce. This one looked abandoned, with weeds growing tall around the door and one window hanging crooked on its frame. But the roof appeared solid, and right now that mattered more than anything else. The wind picked up just as she reached the door, whipping her skirts around her legs and sending her hat tumbling across the grass. She chased after it, grateful when it caught against the corner of the soddy instead of disappearing into the storm. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, and she could smell the sharp scent of rain getting ready to pour down hard. She pushed open the wooden door, expecting to find nothing but dust and maybe some field mice. Instead, she found herself staring at a pair of boots attached to long legs stretched out on the dirt floor. Her heart jumped, and she instinctively stepped back, ready to run despite the approaching storm. "Easy there," came a calm voice from the shadows. "Just taking shelter like you, I reckon." The man slowly sat up, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. He was older than Maggie, maybe 30 or so, with sandy brown hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles of hard ground. "Name's Jim McKenna," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. "Don't mean to startle you, miss. Storm caught me same as you." Lightning flashed outside, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the little soddy. The rain started. Then, not the gentle spring shower Maggie had hoped for, but the kind of downpour that could turn creek beds into raging rivers and wash out roads for days. "Maggie Sullivan," she replied, still standing in the doorway. Her practical side told her that sharing shelter made sense, but her experience had taught her to be cautious around strange men, especially in isolated places. Jim seemed to understand her hesitation. He gestured toward the far corner of the single room where a pile of old straw provided the only furniture. "You're welcome to that spot there. I'll stay over here by the door, case you need to leave quick." His tone was matter-of-fact, without any hint of offense at her obvious wariness. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the thick sod walls and leaking through a small hole in the roof. Maggie made her decision and stepped inside, closing the door against the wind. The soddy was bigger than it looked from outside. With enough room for two people to stay out of each other's way, she settled herself in the corner Jim had indicated, grateful to be out of the weather. From her spot, she could watch him without being obvious about it. He'd gone back to whatever he'd been doing before she arrived, which appeared to be tending to something in a bundle of cloth beside him. "Is that an animal?" she asked, curiosity overcoming caution as she noticed the bundle moving slightly. "Injured hawk," Jim replied, carefully adjusting the cloth. "Found her yesterday with a busted wing. Probably got caught in a twister and thrown against something hard." His hands were gentle as he checked the bird, and Maggie was surprised by the tenderness in his voice. She'd known plenty of men who wouldn't bother with a hurt animal unless it was valuable livestock. The fact that this cowboy had taken time to rescue and care for a wild bird told her something important about his character. "Will she be all right?" Maggie found herself moving closer to get a better look. Hard to say. Wings not broken clean, which is good, but she's been fighting the wrapping, trying to fly. Wild things don't understand when you're trying to help them. The words seemed to carry extra meaning, though Jim's attention remained focused on the hawk. Maggie wondered if he was thinking about more than just the injured bird. The storm raged outside with the fury that prairie weather was famous for. Wind howled around the corners of the soddy, and rain hammered the roof so hard it was difficult to carry on a conversation. But gradually, as the afternoon wore on, they began to talk. Jim told her about his work with the cattle drives, moving herds from Texas up to the railroad towns in Kansas and Nebraska. It was hard, dangerous work that kept him on the trail for months at a time, but he spoke of it with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his calling. "Always dreamed of having my own place," he admitted as they shared the simple meal of dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebags. "Small ranch, maybe. 100 head of cattle. Nothing fancy, just something that's mine." Maggie understood that dream. She told him about her own plans to claim land under the Homestead Act, to prove up her own farm and make a life that belonged to nobody but herself. Most men would have laughed at the idea of a woman homesteading alone, but Jim just nodded thoughtfully. "Takes grit to make it out here," he said. "Doesn't matter much if you're man or woman when the crops fail or the wolves come calling." As the first day turned into evening, the storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Jim checked on his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that he'd managed to get under a makeshift lean-to behind the soddy. Maggie was impressed by how well he'd cared for the animal, making sure it had shelter and feed before seeing to his own comfort. "Looks like we might be here longer than expected," he said when he came back inside, water dripping from his hat. This storm's got staying power. Maggie felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd been careful to avoid situations like this during her months of traveling, always making sure she had a safe place to sleep away from men she didn't know. But the storm left her no choice, and so far Jim had been nothing but respectful. The second day brought more rain and wind, but also longer conversations. Jim had a quiet way of asking questions that invited sharing without seeming pushy. He asked about her travels, her work, and her plans, listening to her answers with genuine interest. Unlike most men she'd met, he didn't try to convince her that her dreams were impractical or dangerous. "You ever get lonely, traveling by yourself?" he asked during one of their talks. Maggie considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I'd rather be lonely and free than crowded and trapped." Jim smiled at that, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "I understand that feeling." The hawk was getting stronger, showing more interest in the small pieces of meat Jim offered. He'd fashioned a larger enclosure from some old boards he'd found in the soddy, giving the bird room to stretch without being able to injure herself further. "You've done this before," Maggie observed, watching him work with practiced efficiency. "My grandmother was part Cherokee," Jim explained. "She taught me about healing things that were hurt. Said it was important to help when you could, even if the creature might never trust you for it." On the second evening, as they sat listening to the rain that seemed like it might never stop, Maggie found herself studying Jim's profile in the dim light of the small fire he'd built. There was something solid about him, reliable in a way that had nothing to do with promises or pretty words. She'd learned to recognize the difference between men who talked about being dependable and those who simply were. When the rain finally stopped on the morning of the third day, Maggie felt an unexpected reluctance to leave the little soddy. The past 2 days had been the most peaceful she'd experienced since beginning her journey. But the trail was calling, and she had plans to keep. Jim was preparing to release the hawk, whose wing had healed enough for her to have a fighting chance in the wild. They stood outside the soddy in the fresh morning air, watching as the bird tested her wings cautiously. "Think she make it?" Maggie asked. "She's got spirit," Jim replied. "Sometimes that's enough." The hawk took flight, then, circling once over their heads before disappearing into the vast blue sky. Maggie felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name as she watched the bird's fierce independence carry her toward freedom. "Where are you headed now?" Jim asked, breaking into her thoughts. "Grand Island. There's a land office there where I can file my homestead claim." Jim was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful. "I could ride with you partway, if you'd like. Make sure you get there safe." The offer hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than the simple words suggested. Maggie looked at this gentle cowboy who'd spent 2 days respecting her space and her choices, who'd cared for an injured bird with the same attention most men reserve for valuable horses. For the first time in her life, accepting help didn't feel like giving up her freedom. The morning sun felt like a blessing after 3 days of rain and thunder. Maggie shouldered her leather satchel and looked one last time at the little soddy that had sheltered them through the storm. It felt strange to be leaving, like closing the door on something that might have been important. Jim was loading his saddlebags onto his horse, moving with the easy efficiency of a man who'd packed up camp countless times. His bay gelding, Ranger, stood patient and ready, ears pricked forward toward the trail ahead. The horse had good manners, Maggie noticed, which told her even more about Jim's character than his gentle way with the injured hawk. "You sure about this?" she asked one more time as they prepared to leave together. Her instinct was still to travel alone, to maintain the independence that had carried her this far. But something about the way Jim had asked to accompany her made it feel less like charity and more like simple companionship. "Road to Grand Island can be tricky this time of year," Jim replied, checking his saddle cinch. "Creek crossings get dangerous after big storms like we just had. Besides, Ranger here could use the easy walking after being cooped up for 3 days." It was a tactful way of offering help without making her feel helpless. Maggie appreciated that more than she could say. Too many men she'd encountered on her travels seemed to think that helping a woman required taking over completely, making decisions for her and treating her like she had no sense of her own. They set out together as the morning mist was lifting from the prairie grass. Jim rode slowly, keeping pace with Maggie's walking speed without making a show of it. The storm had left the world looking fresh and clean, with wildflowers blooming in patches of color across the green landscape. For the first hour, they traveled mostly in comfortable silence. Maggie had grown used to the quiet rhythm of walking during her months on the trail, and she was pleased to discover that Jim wasn't the kind of man who felt the need to fill every moment with talk. When he did speak, it was to point out things that might interest her: a hawk circling overhead, a deer trail leading down to the creek, the way certain clouds might mean more rain later. "You know this country well," Maggie observed as they stopped to rest near a clear stream that hadn't been there before the storm. "Traveled through here plenty of times with cattle drives," Jim replied, dismounting to let Ranger drink. "Each season shows you something different about the same piece of land. Spring brings the flowers, summer burns everything brown, winter shows you the bones of the place." Maggie knelt by the water to refill her canteen, thinking about his words. She'd never stayed in one place long enough to see how it changed through the seasons, always moving on before she could watch the full cycle. The idea of staying somewhere long enough to know it that well seemed both appealing and frightening. They were sharing a simple lunch of hardtack and dried meat when they heard the sound, distant shouting carried on the wind, mixed with the lowing of cattle in distress. Jim was on his feet immediately, his relaxed manner replaced by alert tension. "Trouble," he said simply, swinging up into his saddle. "You stay here where it's safe." But Maggie was already gathering her things. Coming with you?" "Maggie, it could be dangerous. I can handle dangerous," she interrupted, her tone firm but not angry. "I've been doing it for months." Jim looked down at her for a moment, and she could see him weighing his words carefully. "All right," he said finally. "But stay close, and if I tell you to get behind cover, you do it quick." They hurried toward the sounds of distress, Jim on horseback and Maggie keeping pace on foot with the determined stride she developed during her long journey. As they crested a low hill, they could see the source of the commotion below. A homestead sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by scattered cattle and obvious signs of recent violence. The front door of the small house hung open, and belongings were strewn across the yard as if someone had ransacked the place in a hurry. A woman sat on the ground holding a crying baby, while two small children clung to her skirts. A man lay nearby, conscious but clearly hurt. "Raiders?" Jim said grimly. "Looks like they hit this place hard." They rode down into the valley, calling out so the family would know they were friendly. The woman looked up with frightened eyes, ready to run despite her injured husband and small children. "We're here to help," Maggie called out, sliding down from behind Jim on the horse. She approached slowly, keeping her hands visible. "I know something about tending hurt folks." The woman's name was Ruth, and her husband was called Thomas. Their farm was small but well kept, or had been before the raiders swept through like locusts. The attackers had taken most of their livestock, destroyed their grain stores, and roughed up Thomas when he tried to stop them, while Maggie tended to Thomas's injuries, a nasty cut on his head and what looked like bruised ribs, Jim organized a search for the scattered cattle that hadn't been stolen. The raiders had been sloppy in their hurry, and many of the animals had simply wandered off rather than being driven away. "How many men were there?" Jim asked Thomas as Maggie cleaned the head wound with water from the stream. "5, maybe 6, Thomas replied, wincing as Maggie's gentle hands found a tender spot. "Came through fast, took what they wanted, and rode off toward the north. They say anything about coming back? Said this was just a taste? That folks around here needed to learn to share their good fortune." Jim's jaw tightened at that. Maggie had heard about gangs like this before, men who preyed on isolated homesteads, taking what they wanted and using fear to keep their victims from fighting back. "You can't stay here," Jim told the family. "Not until those men are caught or move on to easier pickings." but Thomas shook his head stubbornly. This is our land. We worked 3 years to prove it up, and I won't be driven off by a bunch of thieves. Maggie understood his feelings. She also understood that pride could get a man and his family killed if he wasn't careful about when to fight and when to bend. What if we helped you get ready for them, she suggested. Made it harder. For them to take what they want next time? Jim looked at her with surprise, but he caught on to her thinking quickly. She's right. There's ways to make a small place easier to defend. Hide your valuables, set up warning signals, create good cover for shooting. They spent the rest of that day and the next helping the family prepare for another possible attack. Jim showed Thomas how to create defensive positions around the house, while Maggie worked with Ruth to hide their remaining food stores and valuables in places raiders wouldn't think to look. The work brought out sides of both Jim and Maggie that they hadn't seen in each other before. Jim proved to be a natural leader, good at organizing work and making people feel confident about difficult tasks. Maggie showed skills she'd learned during her travels, how to preserve food quickly, how to create hiding places that looked natural, how to keep children calm when adults were worried. You two work well together? Ruth commented on the second evening as they all sat around the kitchen table planning the defense of the homestead. Like you've been partners for years. Maggie felt her cheeks warm at the observation. It was true, though she hadn't really noticed it until Ruth pointed it out. She and Jim had fallen into an easy rhythm of cooperation, each taking on tasks that suited their skills without having to discuss it much. When the raiders returned 3 days later, the homestead was ready for them. The family was safely hidden in a root cellar Jim had helped reinforce, while Jim and Maggie took positions where they could watch the approaches to the house. The attack, when it came, was swift and violent. The raiders rode in expecting the same easy pickings as before, but this time they met organized resistance. Jim's rifle spoke from the barn loft, while Maggie added her own accurate shooting from behind the woodpile. Thomas, despite his injuries, managed to contribute from a position near the house. The raiders hadn't expected real resistance from what they thought was a defeated family. When their leader took a bullet through the shoulder and another man's horse went down, they decided this homestead had become more trouble than it was worth. They rode off as quickly as they'd come, leaving behind the stolen cattle they'd brought to taunt the family. In the aftermath, as they helped Thomas and Ruth assess the damage and celebrate their victory, Maggie realized something important had changed between her and Jim. They'd worked together under pressure, trusted each other's abilities, and come through it as a team. You're a fine shot, Jim told her as they watched the sun set over the prairie that evening. You're not bad yourself, she replied, surprised by how much his approval meant to her. I mean it, Maggie. Today you proved you can handle whatever comes your way. Most folks, man or woman, would have run when those riders came charging in. For once, Maggie didn't feel the need to defend her capabilities or prove her independence. Jim had seen her in action and accepted her as an equal partner in a dangerous situation. That meant more to her than all the pretty compliments she'd ever received. As they prepared to continue their journey to Grand Island the next morning, Maggie found herself looking forward to more days of traveling with Jim. For the first time in her life, sharing the trail didn't feel like giving up her freedom. It felt like finding something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The land office in Grand Island was busier than Maggie had expected. Men crowded around the counter, some holding official-looking papers while others clutched hand-drawn maps of the territories they hoped to claim. The air was thick with tobacco, smoke, and the nervous energy of people gambling their futures on pieces of prairie that most of them had never even seen. Maggie stood in line with her own carefully prepared documents, her heart beating fast with anticipation. After months of wandering and working for other people, she was finally going to claim something that would belong entirely to her. Jim waited nearby, respectfully giving her space for this important moment while staying close enough to offer support if she needed it. Next, called the clerk, a thin man with wire spectacles who looked like he'd been processing homestead claims since the law was written. Maggie stepped forward and spread her papers on the scarred wooden counter. Margaret Sullivan, she said. Clearly, I want to file a claim under the Homestead Act. The clerk looked up at her with surprise, then glanced around as if expecting to see a husband or father who would handle the paperwork. When he realized she was alone, his expression grew skeptical. Miss, are you sure you understand what you're filing for? This is for a full quarter section, 160 acres. That's a lot of land for a woman to prove up on her own. Maggie had heard this question before and had her answer ready. I understand exactly what I'm filing for, sir. I meet all the requirements. I'm 21 years of age, I'm a U.S. citizen, and I've never taken up arms against the government. The law doesn't say anything about needing to be a man. The clerk shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to dealing with women who knew the law as well as they did. But Maggie's paperwork was in order, and after a few more questions, he began processing her claim. The land she'd chosen was 40 miles northwest of Grand Island, good farming country near a creek that would provide reliable water. When the clerk finally stamped her papers and handed them back, Maggie felt a surge of triumph unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She owned land now, not much, just a piece of prairie that she'd have to break and plant and defend, but it was hers. For the first time since her father died, she had a home waiting for her. Jim was smiling when she turned away from the counter, and she could see genuine happiness for her success in his eyes. Congratulations, he said simply. You've got yourself a fine piece of country. They walked outside into the afternoon sunshine, and Maggie felt like she could float. The whole world seemed brighter, more full of possibility than it had just an hour before. She was a landowner now, a homesteader with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it. We should celebrate, Jim suggested. There's a decent hotel in town with a dining room. Real food, not trail rations? The idea sounded wonderful after weeks of simple camp cooking, but as they walked toward the hotel, Maggie noticed that Jim seemed distracted. He kept glancing toward the telegraph office, and his usual easy confidence had given way to something. That looked like worry. Is everything all right? She asked as they settled at a table in the hotel's dining room. The place was clean and welcoming, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of real coffee drifting from the kitchen. Jim was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was serious. I got some news at the telegraph office while you were filing your claim. My trail boss sent word. He's got a job for me. Big one. Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. What kind of job? Cattle drive to Montana Territory. 3,000 head, maybe more. The biggest contract our outfit's ever landed. Jim's voice carried excitement, but also something that might have been regret. Pay would be enough to buy. My own spread when I get back. Everything I've been working toward. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, Maggie said carefully, though the words felt like stones in her mouth. It is, Jim agreed, but it's also dangerous. Montana's still rough country, lots of hostile territory to cross. And it would mean being gone for 8 months, maybe longer if winter sets in early. The unspoken question hung between them like smoke. Maggie could see the conflict in Jim's eyes, the pull of his longtime dream against something newer, but just as important. She understood because she felt the same tearing sensation in her own chest. When would you have to leave? She asked. Week from today. Trail boss wants to move the herd north before the summer heat gets too bad. A week, 7 days to figure out what these feelings between them meant, whether they were strong enough to change two people's carefully laid plans. Maggie stared down at her coffee, trying to sort through emotions she'd never had to deal with before. The meal that followed was the strangest mixture of celebration and farewell she'd ever experienced. They talked about her land, about the house she'd build and the crops she'd plant. Jim shared his knowledge of farming in this climate, giving her advice about which fields to break first and how to prepare for the harsh prairie winters, but underneath the practical conversation was a deeper current of things left unsaid. Every shared glance, every moment when their hands accidentally touched reaching for the salt, carried the weight of time running out that evening. They walked through the streets of Grand Island as the sun set behind them. The town was livelier at night, with music drifting from the saloons and people calling greetings to each other across the dusty streets. It should have been a perfect ending to a perfect day, but all Maggie could think about was that Jim would be leaving soon. "I could wait for you," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. 8 months isn't so long in the grand scheme of things. Jim stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression pained. "Maggie, you can't put your life on hold for something that might not work out. That drive to Montana is dangerous. Men die on trails like that. And even if I make it back, what if we find out we don't suit each other as well as we think we do?" She knew he was right, but that didn't make it easier to accept. What if we do suit each other? What if this is something worth taking a chance on? "Then it'll still be here when I get back," Jim said gently. "If what's growing between us is real, it'll survive some time apart." But Maggie had seen too many women in frontier towns, waiting by windows for men who never came home. She'd watched hope fade from their eyes as months turned to years, as letters stopped coming and dreams slowly died. The idea of becoming one of those women terrified her more than any storm or raider ever could. They spent the next 3 days in a strange kind of suspended time. Jim helped her buy supplies for her homestead, tools, seeds, basic household goods. That would help her get started on her land. He taught her things about frontier farming that her father had never had to deal with. Sharing hard-won knowledge about this particular piece of country. Maggie treasured every moment, even as she felt them slipping away like water through her fingers. She memorized the sound of Jim's laugh, the way he pushed his hat back when he was thinking hard about something, the gentle way he handled his horse and everything else that mattered to him. On their last evening together, they rode out to sea. Her land? It was beautiful in the soft light of sunset. Rolling hills covered in grass that moved like waves in the evening breeze, with her creek running clear and cold through a grove of cottonwood trees. This would be her home, the place where she'd build the independent life she'd dreamed of for so long. "It's perfect," Jim said, and she could hear the genuine admiration in his voice. "You'll do well here, Maggie. This land will be lucky to have you." They stood there as darkness fell, not talking much, just being together in the place that would soon be hers alone. When Jim finally suggested they head back to town, Maggie felt like she was leaving part of herself behind on that prairie. The morning of Jim's departure came too quickly. Maggie went to see him off, standing with a small crowd of other people who'd come to wish the trail crew well. Jim's horse was loaded with supplies for the long journey, and he looked every inch the experienced cowboy, ready for whatever the trail might throw at him. "Take care of yourself," he said when the moment came for goodbyes. "Write to me if you need anything. The mail runs through here regular enough." "You take care too," Maggie replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Come back safe." Jim mounted his horse and touched the brim of his hat in a final salute. Then he was riding away with the rest of the crew, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared over the horizon. Maggie stood there long after they were gone, feeling more alone than she had since the day her father died, but as she finally turned away and began walking toward her own future, she realized that this loneliness was different from what she'd felt before. This time she wasn't just grieving for what she'd lost. She was also hoping for what might still come to be.